page and we're all talking about the same thing. So big picture, the problem with stormwater, why we're even talking about it, is there's really two kind of key problems with stormwater. There's too much quantity of it. It's just too much volume that flows into the rivers and streams when you have developed lands. That water used to soak in or be captured by trees, and now all of a sudden it's all hitting the stream all at once, and that's bad because it can erode the sides of the stream. And then there's pollutant loading, so the water quality, the quality of the water that's flowing into the stream can be less than ideal because it's flowing off of impervious surfaces, roads, and other surfaces where it's picking up pollutants. So there's kind of a two-pronged issue. And interestingly, though it's a two-pronged issue, for the past 20 years, 30 years, we've really been addressing it as if it's more of a one-pronged issue. And so we know that there's this increased flow rate that causes erosion and scour in streams. And we know that because impervious or developed watersheds can have between 200 to 400 times as much runoff into streams than a stream would experience in pre-development conditions. And that increase in erosion and sediment deposition in the stream bed can lead to reduced biodiversity and habitat loss. And then as a related issue, we have this nutrient issue, which tells us that developed lands can export between 5 and 20% more pollutants, more phosphorus than undeveloped landscapes. And we really kind of attached ourselves to this idea that if we manage for the pollutant volume, it would sort of take care of the pollutant concentrations, or the total water volume. If we manage that it would take care of the pollutant concentrations a little bit. And we started having this discussion with the Clean Water Act, but the Clean Water Act was really addressing point sources, so sources that you can literally point to, like an individual pipe outlet. But it wasn't until 18 years after the Clean Water Act that the NIPDES permit came out. And NIPDES is really, it's a permit that's specific to impervious cover, and it's based on this impervious cover model, which essentially states that when you get greater than 10% of impervious cover in a watershed, that you will result with poor water quality. And so the NIPDES permit expanded about 10 years after it was first developed to have the permittees managed through general permits of stormwater control structures. This is like a lot of background, but this is an important key element thing, which is that we manage the general permits using stormwater control structures. And stormwater control structures are what we're going to talk about today. So what are they? They're just the practices that people use in order to reduce that volume and reduce the pollutant loading. And so they're things like wet retention ponds, dry ponds, infiltration chambers, filter strips, gravel wetlands bioretention. It can be a bunch of different things. And different practices are used for different functions. The stormwater ponds, the wet ponds, are the most commonly used practice to meet state and federal flow, especially in Vermont. Some places use dry ponds a little bit more frequently, but in our region, wet ponds are the most popular. And then there's kind of this other subsection, which are more classically called like green infrastructure, whereas wet and dry ponds are kind of called conventional infrastructure. But we're going to turn that on its head a little bit in the course of this discussion, really trying to understand like why do we differentiate what's a green practice and what's a conventional gray infrastructure practice is kind of one of the things I want to touch on. So if stormwater ponds are so great, what is so great about them? Why are we using them so much? So we know that they're really good at managing volume because they're essentially bathtubs. So you can just pour a bunch of water into them, it'll hold the water, and then it won't be released to the stream except out a little hole, and you can slowly release it over a long period of time, which is ostensibly, which we're thinking is good, is better for water quality. But there's a couple of things that are interesting about this graph that you should see on your screen right now. This is a summary of several reports that the Center for Watershed Protection put together in 2007. And it's a bunch of studies on stormwater pond functioning and wet pond removal efficiencies. So a couple of things to note. That top bar that goes straight across the screen, that is 100% removal. That means 100% of the pollutants that are coming in are being removed. And then that bar at the bottom is -50. And so that means if you're in the negative department, that means more pollutants are leaving the structure than are coming into the structure. There's a bunch of nuances with how this is measured, which we're totally not going to get into because we just want to look at the big picture here. And we're going to just zero in on this where it says TP and TDP. So that just refers to total phosphorus and total dissolved phosphorus. So total phosphorus is all of the phosphorus in the water, and the dissolved phosphorus is like just a portion of that. It's just a subset that's just dissolved. And what you can see here is that the total dissolved portion is hugely variable about the functionality of the pond. In some cases, it's exporting more dissolved phosphorus than is coming in. Now in Vermont, stormwater ponds are regulated to remove about 80% of total suspended solids and 40% of total phosphorus. But it's not really clear from this whether we know that that's actually happening or what's driving these inconsistencies. So we need to know a little bit more about what and how ponds work so we can maybe make sure they work a little bit better. And these negative removal rates are concerning because that means we're actually loading more of a pollutant into the watershed than we would if we just directly discharged stormwater into the stream. So we know that managing for the volume hasn't solved the problem, which is what we set out to do with those NPDES permits. Water quality in streams remains poor, even though we manage much of the stormwater that runs off of the developed lands. And why is that? Well, I'm sure there are a number of reasons, and everybody has a theory, it seems. But stormwater ponds are one thing that we're interested in, and one reason is because they've been used broadly, but some recent research is suggesting they may actually be acting differently than we thought. So a couple of key points. They alter the relative abundance of pollutants from inlet to outlet, so that may explain some of that more dissolved phosphorus is being exported than is coming in. Some thermally stratify, so that means you get a temperature gradient between the bottom of the water column and the top that has an influence on nutrient cycling. And then there are these external versus internal factors that we don't really understand because we've been considering them well-mixed inert reactors. We've considered them bathtubs, but they're really like little ponds. I mean, they are ponds. They act like a pond does. After a while, it really kind of settles in and acts more like a natural pond. So why are these things important? Like I said, stormwater ponds are really common. If design factors are altering the performance, and we have local and state design rules that are all over the place, they may actually be in some cases bad for water quality when the whole point was for them to be good for water quality. And there's so many of them that we really want to make sure we kind of get ahead of this and understand them a little bit more. So now to the meat of what I'm going to kind of run through with you, so you can see this is kind of a national question, international question happening about stormwater pond form and function. And then we're going to take it to the local level and look at like what me and a team of other researchers have been looking at over the course of several years. And I'm going to do it in two parts. And I'm going to move fairly quickly through it because there's a lot of information, but we're not going to touch on everything, but I just kind of wanted you to know that it exists. And so if you want more info, you can get in touch with me. So the first part is a stormwater pond form and function study. Do stormwater ponds in Vermont differ in their water quality, just like TP and total phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus? Are they different? Are any of those differences related to external or internal characteristics? Is phosphorus being released from the sediment into the overlying water column? And could design alterations improve that performance? The second part, which will directly follow this first part, is talking more about modifiers to existing ponds to make them more green. So looking at the floating treatment wetlands. So a brief overview of the study. We looked at 7 permitted stormwater ponds, so ponds that have a state permit up to the 2002 standard. We looked at temperature throughout the water column, and that was to determine whether they were stratifying. We took grab samples of water at the bottom and at the top of the water column. We took sediment grab samples and looked at a bunch of physical and chemical constituents. And then we looked broadly at the plant community and the coverage of the ponds and how that can tell us something about the ecological structure. And we did that in this really simple way, just looking at rooted versus floating plants and algae and seeing about those ratios and how they change. Here's just a couple of pictures of what it looked like out in the pond. So like a quick view of just our conclusions here. It's a small study, and so the results are not really generalizable across the globe, but they do indicate a need for a little bit more study. And also that we should be thinking about pond design in terms not just of external loading, but also these internal dynamics. Some recommendations would be to maximize the fetch, so it's the area across the pond, so that when the wind flows across the pond, it can turn it over, and it will maybe break up some of that stratification, which isn't good for phosphorus release. There's some question about the sediment pond liner soil chemistry bit, and how maybe native soils versus a liner decision should consider chemistry and not just impermeability. A design that encourages macrophytes that are rooted over those ones that are more transient could help improve water quality, and depth could be a factor there. So cattails won't grow when it's, I forget what it is, it's like 2 feet or something like that. They won't grow any deeper than that. So maximizing maybe that like intermediate depth could be play a role in influencing the vegetation that grows there. And then other things, other additional factors like salt from de-icing and that kind of thing. So that's kind of like a really brief overview. I mean, there's obviously a ton more information in here, but that's the brief overview of like ponds function really differently. Like they look different even when they're permitted to the same standard, and they act really differently. And there's a bunch of different things going on. It isn't just how much water is flowing into the pond, and then it sits here for a while, and then it gets magically exported as cleaner, because that's not really happening, and they're acting like little ponds. So if we accept the fact that they're little natural ecosystems, is there anything we can do to make them work better without having to tear them all out? And so one idea that's been floating around and has been experimented with in a bunch of different places are these floating mats of vegetation. And the idea here of the floating mats is that water column depth in stormwater ponds raises and lowers depending on the storm event. And so these float on the top and rise up and down with the variable water level. And they have roots that grow down underneath the raft. And those roots can filter out particulate in the water column, and they can uptake some nutrients. So it's like making the pond sort of like a wetland without having to completely redesign the entire pond. You can still have it function, have the same volume capacity, but maybe get a little bit better removal. So this study is one that I did with Dave Wheeler, who's on the phone, who's in the ether here at South Burlington. It was one of South Burlington stormwater ponds that they managed that we did this study on. So before I think it was in the middle of this study that this report came out, that this is just a little snapshot from, and the Chesapeake Bay, I guess Chesapeake Bay kind of like runs their stormwater thing as a unit. And so they came out with this like approved incremental pollutant removal rate for floating treatment wetlands in ponds. And it's related to what the area of raft coverage in the pond is. And then you can get different incremental removal. So if you go to TP, that's total phosphorus, and then you scroll over to say 30% coverage, if you covered your pond with 30% of your pond is covered with rafts, you can get almost 5% increase in your total phosphorus removal capacity of that pond. And so this study was based on, not a lot, but a few field studies. So we kind of set out to see, even though we started this afterwards, one of the things we were doing was seeing, does this actually play out? Can we get those kind of removals here? So now we're at part 2 officially. So modifiers to existing ponds. Could floating treatment wetlands be used to improve stormwater pond pollutant removal? And by those pollutant removal, we're talking about total suspended solids, total phosphorus, and total dissolved phosphorus. And then the subset of that question is also, do some plants perform better than others in this cold climate based on how well they survive, how much biomass they develop, how much phosphorus they uptake, and what their root systems look like. So the study site here in South Burlington, Dave Wheeler's area. Here's the pond, that's the neighborhood. I zoom in on the neighborhood. There's the little pond, it's got a forebay. And these are the, this is a plan view on the left of the total pond, just like a simplified version of it. And these are all the rafts that are laid out. 4 different species of plants were selected for planting. So each A corresponds to all the rafts with the pickerel weed, and B corresponds to soft stem bulrush, and yada yada. And then on the right, this is a zoom in of a pair of the rafts and what they look like. How we did the holes, how we did the foam. This is a cross-sectional view of the plan, how they're anchored in the water column, flotation foam. This is just a couple of fun pictures of when we were building them. So I was at Sea Grant at the time, actually, too. So this is at UVM. And this is some polyflow biological filter material that we ordered and built the rafts ourselves. You can buy these pre-manufactured, but they're really expensive. And so one of the things we wanted to do as we were working with Dave was, you know, Dave is representing a municipality, and if he can get improvements in water quality, that's his goal, but not breaking the bank, obviously, because there's a finite amount of resources. So we were experimenting with a cheaper way to do it. Just an AmeriCorps intern, putting some holes in the rafts, pouring in the foam. We ordered some plants, and then Dave drew down the pond depth so we could install. So the pond looks pretty sad on this day, but it's not usually that low. But we made installation a little easier. So this is right after they were installed, and early in the spring, so there's not much going on there. It's pretty sad. But then this is how they grew up over the years. So there's a lot of growth on them there, looking a little bit more hardy, some of them more than others. That's, I think, like an August day, so you can almost not even tell the difference between the rafts and the perimeter vegetation. So they really grew up well. And there we are in the pond, and you can almost, yeah, you can see how much vegetation is growing on the surface. So again, I'm just going to jump right into the results here, and there's a lot more that could be said about the methods. So if you're interested in any of those things, let me know. But this is kind of this is a little bit of a summary, and this is to tell you that this is that it's a little bit complicated, I guess. But the thing to note here is these ones that are shaded in yellow, that means that there is a difference between influent and effluent. And I'm pointing this out because if you look at total phosphorus and total dissolved phosphorus in the year 2015, so 2015 was before we put anything in. We measured for a year before we put anything in. We measured the year we installed, which is 2016, and we measured for a full year after we installed. The year of 2015, when there was nothing in, that pond was, in any of the storms that we captured, it was not removing any total phosphorus or any total dissolved phosphorus. So if I was somebody who was managing that pond and assuming that it was removing 40% of the total phosphorus, I would be puzzled and a little concerned that it wasn't. And then you can see in 2017, so this is after a full year with the floating treatment wetlands, we are getting significant removal of total phosphorus, but not of total dissolved phosphorus. So, you know, this is concerning because that means, at least without the floating treatment wetlands there, we're getting zero removal of phosphorus, at least from the storms that we were sampling. There's more to that water quality story, but that's kind of like the big picture takeaway. And then I want to tell you, because this is like a little bit more fun, I think, and it tells a clearer story, is about the plants. So we wanted to find out which plants work well here in Vermont. And so we looked at the soft stem bulrush, common rush, pickerelweed, and long-haired sedge. And this is how well they survive the winter. So that's a big concern. A lot of these studies with floating treatment wetlands have taken place in the Carolinas and in Virginia. And there's been several in France. In any case, all of them have been in temperate climates. And so we thought we should see if there's a difference. They tend to say that pickerelweed, those studies have really good performance with pickerelweed, but pickerelweed in our case didn't even make it through the winter. So that doesn't make it a very good choice. But soft stem bulrush was a champ. They all made it through. And long-haired sedge did pretty well as well. And then we measured plant biomass. So this is just like how much stuff are the plants producing? How much total volume of plant material is there?
And you'll notice here, if you're paying attention, that was an extra plant. Now we have 5. And this is the Bidden's vulgata, which is known as the beggar's tick colloquially. And we did not plant it on the rafts, but it volunteered its services. And so we thought, let's put him in there and see how he does. So we don't know about the survival rate because he wasn't planted, but we did look at the total biomass at the end of the year. And it's hugely variable, more variable than any other, but it's actually, in some cases, really woody and a lot of biomass. But then the second best performer was long-haired sedge. So now there's two thumbs up for long-haired sedge. And then we looked at the concentration and the total mass of phosphorus in the shoots, so in the upper part of the plants. And you can see, so the concentration is just, so how many grams of phosphorus are in every kilogram of plant material. And if you look at it in that way, you'd see that Bidden's vulgata, the beggar's tick that showed up on its own, and pickerelweed are the winners. But if you consider that you would be multiplying that total concentration by the total mass in order to figure out like how much total phosphorus is actually captured inside this vegetation. Beggar's tick and pickerelweed don't do so well anymore. Now it's really the long-haired sedge, and well, I guess beggar's tick is still up there, but the pickerelweed really drops off because it's so small. So it's kind of a twofer. You need a big plant and something that's picking up a lot of phosphorus. And long-haired sedge, again, was doing great. And then this last part, which to me is my favorite part because I think it's kind of a cool way to look at it. We looked at the root architecture. So if one of the fundamental mechanisms for how pollutants are being removed is through this just filtration through the root zones, we wanted to see what are these root zones like? Do they vary by plant species, and are some of them better than others? And so we took root segments and we measured them all, and we took photos of them at the same aspect on a light box, and then we ran those images through this computer program called GIA Roots, and it measures surface area and volume and total length and things like that. And so when we looked at all that, we saw that this last part here, this root architecture at the end of this graph that you're seeing, that shows you which ones did best. And the long-haired sedge again had the longest roots and the biggest surface area, tied by root length with Bidden's vulgata. The thing about those Bidden's vulgata roots is they were super, super long, but they had no hair on them. They were really not much surface area, but insanely long, which may make them not that good for floating treatment wetlands because they may root when you don't want them to, and then they'd be like ripping up some sediment when the pond level goes up again. So if we were looking at them all together, we were trying to pick a winner, we would say that long-haired sedge, Caris camosa, did the best overall of all the other plant species. It grew really well, it survived the winter, and its roots were long and hairy. So some big conclusions. So stormwater ponds are widely variable in their form and in their function. They also, which is counter to sort of how we treat them, I guess, from like an engineering perspective, they are hosts to active ecological communities, and they're more complex than just settling basins. Their phosphorus is being cycled internally within them. Life cycles of many species are started and completed in the confines of the pond, and they're more complex than maybe we thought. But that isn't necessarily a liability. That could be an opportunity, because if we're thinking of them as gray infrastructure, but they're in fact a green infrastructure, we could maybe capitalize on that green factor and use what we know about nutrient cycling in the natural environment to harness more of their capacity, because maybe they're better than bathtubs. And lastly, just that existing ponds that we already have warrant a review, and nobody knows this better than Dave Wheeler, because Dave does this for South Burlington and knows that they have a lot of ponds that they manage, and in some cases they are reviewing them to the point where they're replacing those ponds with gravel wetlands, which have a better phosphorus removal capacity, because that makes more sense for them. But not every town has a Dave Wheeler who's really like hitting it hard and looking at all the numbers, and so we there's a lot of room for us to look at ponds more critically across the state and see if we can improve them either by a total overhaul or just a little tweaking of the design. Maybe adding floating treatment wells. And I'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
Fantastic. Thank you, Becky. That was really fun to learn from you. So I think Ashley said that she can open it up so people can turn on their own microphones and just ask. And I think that would be great if that's a function that we can make happen. Then it would be great to have people be able to ask your own questions directly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. So if you have a question, you should have the option to raise your hand. If you could also just toss something in the chat and I can promote you as well if that's easier. And if you would rather ask your question anonymously through the chat box, that is also an option.
I'm going to ask a question while people are thinking.
Scott Hamshaw raised his hand.
Oh, okay, great.
Oh, great.
Glad you can see that.
Let's see.
I don't know. It just says it on my screen.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Let me promote to panelists. Here you go, Scott.
He's up there, but he's still muted. I think you just have to unmute yourself, Scott. Oh, there he is. Hey, Scott.
Hello. Thank you. I enjoyed that talk a lot.
Thanks.
I don't have a strong background in plants or plant nutrient uptake. And so I was just kind of wondering, like, I hear maybe from people more on the ecology side of just how variable, like, phosphorus and nutrient dynamics are in natural, like, wetlands, and that sometimes they can, become sources of phosphorus at certain times of the year and stuff like that. So there's just a lot of complexity. And I'm curious, like, if we're kind of seeing that in maybe these stormwater or wet ponds, like what's the kind of like core intervention with the putting plants in there that would physically like remove phosphorus from the system?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I think that's like the elephant in the room with the plant piece. There's a really well done study that some folks at Virginia Tech did that looked in detail in floating treatment wetlands about that question about nutrient cycling within each of the plants and in different species. And so, I think one of the things you're alluding to is like the plants will uptake and they'll store a lot of nutrients in their stems and leaves in certain parts of the year. And then right before senescence, they pump them back into the roots because the tops will die and then they'll need more nutrients in the roots. And then obviously there's a huge variability based on species. Some just store more phosphorus, just like some of them will store more carbon. And that wasn't the focus of the study. And one of the reasons why is that there was a previous related, really well done study that was looking at that cycling within each of the plant types. And essentially that's not the dominant mechanism of removal in the ponds anyway with floating treatment wetlands because it's so small. Like the amount of phosphorus they uptake is actually really tiny. So if you're really trying to remove phosphorus, the best and most efficient way to do it would be through filtration, better filtration and increased flocculation and sedimentation underneath the floating treatment wetlands. So, there's an argument to be made. People have said, well, then the plants are just window dressing, which is like always the question that comes up in green infrastructure. Like, well, then you don't need the plants. And it's like, well, yeah, well, you need the roots, you need the architecture of the roots, and plants kind of maintain these structures for you, and they're not made of plastic. Like, there's some benefits to having a plant root. The study that I mentioned in Virginia that looked at how the nutrient cycle, they had suggested total removal of the upper part of the plants, and they had like timing for it. Like, if you're going to do this, remove them July 15th, and then you won't have that problem of them like pumping the nutrients back into the water column. It's also one of the reasons that one of our recommendations from this study is to try and make ponds that don't have floating plants, that have rooted plants instead, because you may just be able to like close that cycle a little bit, because when you have a floating plant, everything it's doing is directly in contact with the water. So if it's dying and releasing nutrients, it's leaving the pond. Whereas like a rooted macrophyte, it just kind of stores it in the soil and maybe doesn't leave. So I mean, that's a long way to say, I don't know.
No, that was really helpful. That helped answer a bunch of questions, because like kind of the follow-up, which you already answered, was like, you know, does plant removal from the system, you know, after they've grown in a component.
Yeah, and you know, and in a related point, gravel wetlands now, like the recommendation out of the UNH Stormwater Center is that gravel wetlands and bioretention should be removing all of the upper plant parts, so cut down to the level of the soil every 3 years if you really want to keep up with that phosphorus removal. And so we don't have like specifics like that for floating treatment wetlands, but it makes sense that something similar would be the case for a wet pond and or a wet pond with a floating treatment wetland.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
That would be a great stewardship project for one of our school groups to go remove. And actually, a play off of Scott's questions is there an opportunity to have a market, a commercial market for harvesting plant material and then extracting the phosphorus from it to sell as a fertilizer after it's composted or something like that? Because, you know, wherever you're putting that has to be managed as well.
Right.
So is it exporting it from a place that doesn't need more?
Yeah, you know, what I learned a lot from Eric Roy, but maybe the thing that I think about most often is he wrote this really awesome paper that details the volume of phosphorus in all of these waste streams. And anything that's biomass is like teeny tiny. And so he was sort of like, you can do it, but the energy usage of trying to do that is sky high. And you know, unless you just compost, unless you do like a straight compost. But then there's a question, because it's in stormwater ponds, is it uptaking heavy metals? And then you're like spreading heavy metals around.
Right. Good point. Do other people have questions? I don't think I see hands up.
Dave Wheeler, if you're out there, you got to have something, or a correction at least.
We should ask Dave a question. Has he done anything as a result of knowing this information?
Or we should ask him, how do those floating treatment wetlands look today? I haven't been out there in a while. Maybe he'll say. All right, Dave is on the call.
Can you hear me?
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, great presentation. And yeah, you know, we have been just kind of going all in on gravel wetlands recently, I would say. And something kind of interesting, just like for South Burlington in particular, we're working on our phosphorus control plan right now. And we found that with all of the ponds that we've constructed over the years, we think we're already meeting our target for phosphorus reduction for the TMDA.
Nice.
So, you know, that leaves us in an interesting situation where moving forward, we still have like 100 ponds we need to build for our full restoration plans. So are we going to do just flow-based practices, or are we going to continue to do, you know, maximize phosphorus removal as well? I think we're going to try and maximize phosphorus removal as we move forward. You know, we're waiting to actually speak with the state about if we can take that additional credit and, you know, perhaps sell it to neighboring communities who are a little bit behind the curve. See what the market is for phosphorus credit out there. Yeah, but baked into those calculations is the assumption that ponds get a certain removal rate, right? So if that were to ever change, then yeah, I think we'd certainly be potentially looking at rolling out more floating treatment wetlands, or, you know, things like that for existing ponds that we're not necessarily going to convert to gravel wetlands. You know, it'd be interesting, like what that 5% removal additional, how much does it cost to put in like a floating treatment wetland?
Yeah, like, is it worth that 5% increase?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Versus, you know, we are doing some research on some of our gravel wetlands to see if those get the removal rate that we think they do.
Oh yeah, what are you finding on that? Anything?
I don't think we have enough good data yet.
Yeah.
It's been pretty dry this summer. We had like, yeah, a couple of the storms, they just, you know, they come in like Saturday night at like
Of course.
8 a.m. and something wasn't set up or ready.
Yeah.
So that's how that goes. Yeah, you know, hopefully we'll be able to get enough data to get some results, but
Cool.
yeah, I don't think we have anything conclusive at this point. So
Well, thanks,
yeah,
Dave.
we're not, you know, fully embracing treatment wetlands at this point, like the floating ones, but
Yeah.
certainly something we're very aware of and would potentially consider in the future.
Nice.
Nice.
How many gravel wetlands do you all have? Because you said you were really doing a lot of those.
Yeah, we have maybe 5 or 6 at this point.
Okay.
But yeah, just in the past like 2 years, I would say we've been primarily, like, all of our design, you know, is either like we've got a couple infiltration practices, and that's obviously #1 priority if we can do infiltration. But for the most part in South Burlington, due to the soils and the groundwater table, it's just not feasible to infiltrate. So at that, you know, that point we go towards gravel wetlands.
That makes sense.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Becky, I'm curious about the pickerel weed. So that's one of my favorite plants when I'm paddling out in a lake.
Oh yeah.
So I was surprised to hear that it didn't make it through the winter. Any ideas why? Like, what's different about these ponds versus a natural setting somewhere else in Vermont?
I think it had to do with them not being rooted. So it's, you know, even though ponds, their natural setting, all of these plants, we're asking them to not have any sediment, not have any soil. Yeah, and then exist like exposed out in the pond. And they're pretty small as it is. They're sort of late bloomers, which is another challenge, I think, just in getting them to establish in the raft. You know, I think there may still be a hope for the pickerel weed, but it just would need, I think, a later start. I think part of its problem that first year was we were planting them really early as plugs, and you know, pickerel weed are just sort of a little bit later to come up. So it may have just been stressed from the get-go. And then also it's exposed in a pond that freezes fully because it's a teeny tiny pond. Right. So, you know, maybe we could do another round of looking at that pickerel weed a little closer.
That's cool. That's a good thought. I had forgot already that they're floating out there. And
yeah.
Sounds cool. Yeah.
It's a little harder for them. Yeah.
Anybody else have questions? We don't have to. We can keep talking, but we don't have to unless people want to.
Oh, Sarah.
Sarah? All right, let me promote you, Sarah.
Okay. Can you see me? Hi.
Hi, Sarah.
Yes.
Hi. I guess my question, I was thinking about the chart with the phosphorus uptake levels and the ones where it was really low or even negative.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the phosphorus is kind of going back into the watershed instead of being retained?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it means. And it means even more than it just going back into the watershed, it means it's that the pond is serving as a source itself.
Okay.
That the water coming in has less, you could look at it as it's less polluted coming in than it is going out.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the second part of my question was, I know stormwater and phosphorus are also like keywords in the discussion with algae blooms in the lake. So have you found any evidence that the FTWs have made any difference? Because I know it's a really delicate balance in terms of the phosphorus levels going into the lake Is there any
Yeah.
evidence that those make a difference or not at all?
Well, I mean, our study was tiny. It was just a little stormwater pond. So to extrapolate it out to like the lake, we'd kind of we'd lose the signal. But to your point, the reason we looked at the total phosphorus and the dissolved phosphorus was because of what you're saying, and that is that some of the total phosphorus, especially when it's washed off of developed lands, it's already bound up to particles. So it's already attached really tightly. So if it lands in the lake, it's just still attached, and it may just stay attached, and it's not really that big of a deal. I mean, as a piece of phosphorus. But some forms of phosphorus are really bioavailable. They're inorganic and they're like ready to be taken up. And so that whole fraction question about like what kind of phosphorus it is trying to get at that point of like, yeah, phosphorus is coming out of the ponds, but like what kind? Because if it's the bad kind, then this is a bigger issue. And what we found, and what also that summary graph, which you're talking about with the different removal rates, that's what they were showing, is that the dissolved phosphorus was loading sometimes 50% more than it was taking in. So it means like, what that means is if 100 pounds of dissolved phosphorus comes in, 150 pounds leaves the pond. And so that's an even bigger deal than the total phosphorus, because the total dissolved is more likely for it to have that inorganic fraction that can be taken up. And it's secondarily interesting because the state of Vermont does not regulate dissolved phosphorus at all. It only regulates on total phosphorus. So, you know, we don't really even know, because we're not asking that question about these practices. We're not asking that question at all. We're just calling every piece of phosphorus the same. And that's, you know, could be biting us.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Thanks, Sarah. It looks like Scott put another question here in the chat box. Becky, Scott's asking, could you describe a little more about the timing of the phosphorus sampling in the ponds in relation specifically, I think, to the timing of storms?
Yeah, so we did half of the pond samples right either during or right after a storm. So the pond was in turnover mode, and half of them were in dry periods. So I can't remember, I think it's 72 hours preceding had to be dry, no rainfall. And so, yeah, we did sort of try to parse that out and see some differences. And we do see different correlatory relationships depending on whether it's a dry or a wet sampling period. But we'd be getting into the weeds. I don't remember right off the top of my head what the differences were, but some of those, like what was a strong relationship. Well, broadly, what's a strong relationship to watershed factors is strong during rain events. And those relationships are stronger to internal dynamics when it's a dry period, which makes sense, because when it's a dry period, nothing's coming in and it's just all about what's happening in the pond. And when it's a rain event, everything's coming in. So you'd expect, you know, if you have a really big watershed with a lot of impervious, then yeah, you're going to get a lot of water and particulate laden water in. So in general, yeah.
Thank you.
And it looks like Elizabeth has their hand up as well. Elizabeth, I'm going to promote you. You should be getting prompted.
Oh, can you hear me or see me
Yeah.
or anything?
We
Yep,
can,
I can hear
we
you.
can't see you. Okay.
So I had two questions. So you mentioned that the pond is like a source. So did you ever measure the residence time for the pollutant?
The residence time in the pond.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm not even sure how you would do that with the phosphorus and sediment. You know, the ponds themselves have a, I guess you'd call it a residence time, or it's called something different. Dave would know. It's just like the amount of time that you assume it takes for a water droplet that comes in to leave. And I guess these are like 24-hour. Is that right, Dave? They're like 24-hour holding time. But I don't know what the residence time of each because what happens is it doesn't stay in the water, right? Like that's when
Okay.
it gets complicated, because it either drops out into sediment, or it's taken up by plants, or it's taken up by algae, or something like that. So it would really it would depend on what sink it's being attached to for us to be able to determine what the residence time would be. Because for the sediments, if it's chemically bound to aluminum, for instance, it's probably going to be in there until Dave tells somebody to go dig it out of there. It just stays there forever. But if it's bound to iron and it's a stratifying pond, it might not make it through the month. But maybe once it's released, it's picked up by algae, and then it, I don't know. That seems complicated. I don't know. I don't know how I would do that. Scott might know.
Okay, thank you. And also, so you mentioned also was in the table that there were like multiple different factors you were looking into for the different kinds of plants to use. Are there any like factors that were more important or less important? Because you had the deciding factor based off of which had the most X's, like which checked the most boxes, but was there also like some factors that were more important than others?
That's a good question, and no, and it's sort of a simplistic way to just display it. It was really like whichever one got the high, like the most statistically significant best thing in each characteristic got like 1 point basically. And
Okay.
If anything was tied, then it wasn't. But so yeah, nothing was like graded more than others. I'm trying to think. So it was like survival, pea uptake, root architecture, and biomass. Yeah, probably some of those should be more important than others. That's a good point. Like survival seems pretty important. That one should have been ranked higher.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining the conversation, literally in face and voice and whatnot. And Becky, for sharing your expertise with us. Really super fun to learn and to have that connection with Dave and what's happening in the city where research was done.
Thanks for coming, Dave.
So just so folks know, the way that we're doing this, it's kind of every other week, but that's sort of not really applicable because I've changed things around a little bit. So the next guest speaker we'll have for the class is on September 28th, and that's Chelsea Mandigo, who is, I think, Dave's counterpart in the Village of Essex Junction. She's the stormwater coordinator for the village, so she's going to talk about some of the challenges and the solutions that community has faced and implemented with stormwater. And then off cycle is on the 29th of September. There will be a presentation by folks from Oregon Sea Grant who are talking about the potential presence of and risks from COVID-19 in water. So it's more on a wastewater side of things, but it could be moving stormwater for CSOs. So I'll send out links to those via the Green Infrastructure Collaborative Roundtable listserv for people to register for maybe later today or tomorrow. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Becky. Thanks all.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you all. Take care.